Eleanor Grayson sat in her armchair by the bay window, the one that overlooked the sprawling garden she'd tended for decades. The roses were wilting now, their petals curling inward like her own thoughts. At 82, her hands trembled when she reached for her tea. But her mind was sharp, replaying the conversation that had shattered her world just 3 days ago. "Mom, you're old. You're useless now. Just stay out of my way," her son, Richard, had said, his voice cold as he stood in the doorway of her home. His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut deeper than any blade, slicing through the love she'd poured into him for 50 years. Richard, her only child, had once been the boy who clung to her skirts, who laughed as she read him bedtime stories. Now, he was a stranger in a tailored suit, his eyes fixed on his phone, his life too busy for her. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the porcelain cup, the warmth seeping into her palms, but not her heart. She'd raised Richard alone after her husband, Thomas, died in a car accident when Richard was just 10. She'd worked 2 jobs, sacrificed dreams of her own, and built a life for them both. The estate she'd inherited from her parents, a modest but beautiful house in upstate New York, surrounded by acres of green, had been her anchor. She'd always planned to pass it to Richard, to keep it in the family. But his words echoed, useless. She set the cup down, her gaze drifting to the garden. The roses needed pruning, but her knees ached too much to kneel in the dirt anymore. She felt the weight of her age, the creak of her bones, the slow betrayal of her body. But useless? No. She'd never been useless. Not when she'd bandaged Richard's scraped knees. Not when she'd stayed up nights balancing the checkbook to keep the lights on. Not when she'd taught herself to cook his favorite meals just to see him smile. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was the hospital, reminding her of her appointment tomorrow. Eleanor had been diagnosed with heart failure 6 months ago. The doctors were kind but blunt. Her time was limited. She'd nodded, accepting the news with the same quiet strength she'd always carried. But Richard hadn't visited once since the diagnosis. He'd sent a text, "Sorry. Work's crazy. Let me know if you need anything." She hadn't replied. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, her steps slow but steady. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, and she settled into a chair, clutching her purse. A nurse approached, her smile warm but not pitying. "Mrs. Grayson, I'm Clara. I'll be with you today." Clara was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that held a quiet understanding. She helped Eleanor to the exam room, her touch gentle but firm. As the doctor ran tests, Clara stayed close, chatting softly about the weather, then about Eleanor's garden. "I used to help my grandma with her roses," Clara said, her voice bright. She'd say they were stubborn, just like her. Eleanor smiled for the first time in days. Clara's presence was a balm, not because she was overly cheerful, but because she saw Eleanor not as a frail old woman, but as a person with stories, with a life. When the doctor left to review the results, Clara stayed, pulling a chair beside Eleanor's bed. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," she said softly. Eleanor hesitated, then found herself speaking. She told Clara about the garden, about Thomas, about Richard's childhood, and then, haltingly, about his words. "He said I'm useless," she whispered, her voice breaking. Clara didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes. She just listened, her hand resting lightly on Eleanor's. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt heard. Not invisible, not useless. That night, back in her quiet house, Eleanor sat at her desk, a single lamp casting a warm glow. She pulled out her will, the one she'd drafted years ago, leaving everything to Richard. Her pen hovered over the page. His words echoed again, but so did Clara's quiet compassion. Eleanor's heart, weak as it was, still burned with a fire she hadn't felt in years. She began to write, her hand steady for the first time in weeks. Eleanor's pen scratched across the paper, each stroke deliberate. She wasn't rewriting her will, yet just notes. Thoughts. Fragments of a life she'd lived and the choices she now faced. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had once comforted her but now felt like a countdown. Her heart condition made every moment precious, and Richard's rejection made every decision weighty. She leaned back, her eyes tracing the room. The walls were lined with photos, Richard's first birthday, his graduation, the day he got his first job. She'd framed each milestone, proud of the man he'd become. But where was that boy now? The one who'd run to her with scraped knees, who'd begged for one more story. Somewhere along the way, he'd grown distant, consumed by a life she didn't understand. Boardrooms, investments, a world of numbers and ambition. She'd try to keep up, asking about his work, but his answers were clipped, his visits rare. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to Clara. The nurse's kindness had been a lifeline, not because it was grand, but because it was genuine. Clara hadn't treated her like a burden or a checklist. She'd listened, her hand steady on Eleanor's, her presence a quiet reminder that Eleanor still mattered. It wasn't just the act of holding her hand. It was the way Clara had seen her, not as a patient, but as a woman with a past, with dreams, with pain. The next week, Eleanor returned to the hospital for another appointment. Clara was there again, her smile a familiar comfort. As they waited for the doctor, Clara asked about the roses. "Did you get to prune them yet?" she said, her tone light but curious. Eleanor shook her head. "My knees won't let me anymore. But I miss the dirt, the thorns, the way they bloomed despite everything." Clara nodded, her eyes soft. "Sounds like you've got a green thumb and a strong heart." Eleanor laughed, a sound that surprised her. Strong heart. The doctors might disagree. Clara's expression didn't falter. "Hearts are more than muscle. Mrs. Grayson, yours has carried you this far." The words landed gently, like rain on parched soil. Eleanor felt a warmth she hadn't known she'd been craving. Over the next few visits, a routine formed. Clara would check Eleanor's chart, adjust her for, and then sit for a moment, talking about small things: gardening, books, the stray cat Clara fed outside her apartment. Eleanor shared stories of her youth, the summer she'd backpacked across Europe, the night she'd met Thomas at a dance hall, the way his laugh had made her feel invincible. Clara listened, her eyes bright with interest, never rushing, never glancing at her watch. One afternoon, as Clara helped her into a wheelchair, Eleanor asked, "Why do you do this? You're young, smart. You could be anything." Clara paused, then smiled. "My mom was sick when I was a kid. The nurses who cared for her, they made her feel human, not just a patient. I wanted to do that for someone else." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. Clara's words weren't rehearsed. They were real, rooted in a life shaped by loss and love. That night, Eleanor sat at her desk again, the will open before her. She thought of Richard, of the estate, of the roses she'd never prune again. She thought of Clara, who'd given her something Richard hadn't in years: dignity. Her pen moved, not to erase Richard's name, not yet, but to add a new one. Clara's. It was a small act, a test, but it felt right. Outside, the wind stirred the garden. and Eleanor imagined the roses swaying, stubborn and alive, just like her. The weeks blurred into a rhythm of hospital visits and quiet evenings. Eleanor's world had shrunk her home. The hospital, the garden she could only admire from her window. But Clara's presence grew larger, a steady light in the fog of her days. Each visit brought a new story, a new connection. Clara spoke of her childhood in a small town, her dreams of traveling, her quiet pride in her work. Eleanor, in turn, shared pieces of her past she hadn't revisited in years, the way Thomas had proposed under a starlit sky, the nights she'd stayed up sewing Richard's Halloween costumes. But Richard remained a shadow. He called once. His voice rushed. "Mom, I'm swamped. I'll visit soon." "Okay." Eleanor murmured agreement. But the line went dead before she could say more. She stared at the phone, her chest tight. She wanted to believe he was just busy, that the boy she'd raised was still there. But his absence was louder than his words. One afternoon, Clara noticed Eleanor's quiet mood. "Everything okay, Mrs. Grayson?" she asked, adjusting the blood pressure cuff with care. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke. "My son, he hasn't come by." "Not since." She trailed off, the memory of his words old, useless still raw. Clara's face softened, but she didn't pry. Instead, she said, "Sometimes people get lost in their own lives. Doesn't mean they don't care." Eleanor nodded, but the doubt lingered. That evening, Eleanor walked through her house, touching the things she'd built her life around. The dining table where she'd taught Richard to read. The bookshelf filled with novels they'd shared. She stopped at a photo of Richard, now 48, smiling at a company gala. He looked polished, successful, but distant. When had he stopped needing her? When had she become a burden? The next day, Clara brought a small gift to the hospital, a packet of rose seeds. "For your garden," she said, her smile shy. "I thought you might like to try something new." Eleanor's eyes stung. It wasn't just the seeds. It was the thought, the care. She clutched the packet, her voice thick. "You're too kind, Clara." Clara shook her head. "You're easy to be kind to." That night, Eleanor made a decision. She called her lawyer, Margaret, a no-nonsense woman who'd handled her affairs for years. "I want to change my will," Eleanor said, her voice steady. Margaret paused. "Are you sure? This is a big step." Eleanor was sure. She wasn't erasing Richard entirely, not yet, but she wanted to leave something for Clara. A thank you for the humanity she'd given her. Margaret arrived the next day, her briefcase filled with papers. They sat at the dining table, the same one where Richard had once done his homework. Eleanor explained her wishes: the estate house, land. Savings would go to Clara, with a portion set aside for Richard. Margaret raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "This is your choice, Eleanor. I'll make it legal." As Margaret drafted the changes, Eleanor felt a strange relief, like a weight lifting. But the decision wasn't without pain. She thought of Richard, of the boy he'd been. Could she really cut him out? She didn't want to punish him, only to honor the person who'd reminded her of her worth. The pen trembled in her hand as she signed the preliminary draft. But she signed it. Outside, the roses stood tall, their thorns sharp, their blooms defiant. The new will sat in a locked drawer, its existence a secret Eleanor carried like a stone in her chest. She hadn't told Richard, hadn't told Clara. It felt too final, too raw. But every time she saw Clara at the hospital, her resolve strengthened. Clara's kindness wasn't transactional. She didn't know about the will, didn't expect anything. She simply cared. And that care was a gift Eleanor hadn't realized she'd been starving for. One chilly afternoon, Richard appeared unannounced. Eleanor was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find him standing there, his coat dusted with snow, his face taut. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her heart stuttered not from joy, but from dread. They sat in the living room, the air heavy. Richard didn't look at the photos on the walls, didn't ask about her health. "I heard you've been to the hospital a lot," he said, his tone clipped. "You should have told me." Eleanor's hands folded in her lap. "I did. You were busy." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned forward. "I've been thinking about the house. It's too much for you to manage now. Maybe it's time to sell. Move somewhere smaller." Eleanor's breath caught. The house, her home. Her parents' legacy wasn't just brick and mortar. It was where she'd raised him, where she'd mourned Thomas, where she'd found solace in her garden. "This is my home," she said quietly. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, be realistic. You're not getting younger. You can't keep up with it." There it was again, old, useless, cloaked in different words. Eleanor's voice trembled but held firm. "This house is mine to decide about. Richard." His eyes narrowed. "And what happens when you're gone? You think I want to deal with this place?" The words stung, but they also clarified something for Eleanor. He didn't see the house as home, only as an asset. She stood, her knees protesting but her spine straight. "I've made arrangements," she said. Richard's brow furrowed. "What arrangements?" She didn't answer, not ready to reveal the will. Instead, she said, "I'm tired. Richard, we'll talk another time." He left, his frustration hanging in the air like smoke. The next hospital visit was a blur of tests, but Clara's presence grounded her. As Clara adjusted her fore, Eleanor asked, "Do you ever feel taken for granted?" Clara paused, then nodded. "Sometimes. But I try to focus on the people who see me, not the ones who don't." Eleanor smiled faintly. Clara's words were simple, but they echoed Eleanor's own resolve. That night, Eleanor called Margaret again. "Make it final," she said. The estate to Clara, with a trust for Richard enough to help. But not everything. Margaret didn't question her. The papers were prepared, and Eleanor signed them, her heart heavy but certain. She wasn't punishing Richard. She was choosing to honor the person who'd reminded her of her own value. As she locked the will away, Eleanor looked out at the garden. The roses, dusted with snow, stood resilient, their beauty undimmed by the cold. Winter settled over the estate, blanketing the garden in frost. Eleanor's health was fading faster now. The doctor spoke of weeks, maybe months. She felt it in the heaviness of her limbs, the shortness of her breath. But there was a clarity in her mind, a peace she hadn't known in years. The will was final, her decision made. She hadn't told Clara, hadn't wanted to burden her with the weight of it. But she knew the time was coming. Richard called again, his tone softer this time. "Mom, I'm coming over tomorrow. We need to sort things out." Eleanor agreed, though her heart raced. She didn't know how he'd react to the truth, but she was tired of carrying it alone. When Richard arrived, he brought coffee and a strained smile. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting across from her. "I was harsh last time. I worry about you. Alone here." Eleanor studied him, searching for the boy she'd raised. She saw glimpses of him in his eyes, but they were clouded by years of distance. "I'm not alone," she said. I have people who care. Richard frowned. Who? Your neighbors. They barely check on you. Eleanor took a deep breath. Clara, my nurse. She's been there for me. More than you know. Richard's expression hardened. A nurse. Mom. She's paid to care. Don't be naive. The words cut. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She's not paid to listen. To make me feel human. That's more than I've had from you in years. The room fell silent. Richard's face reddened. But he didn't speak. Eleanor continued. Her voice steady. I've changed my will. Richard. The estate goes to Clara. You'll have a trust. Enough to live well. But this house. This land, it's hers. Richard stared. Disbelief turning to anger. You're giving everything to a stranger. After all I've done. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. But she held his gaze. What have you done? Richard. When have you been here? He stood. Pacing. I've been building a life. Mom. For us. You think I wanted to be away? Eleanor shook her head. I think you forgot how to see me. The words hung between them. Heavy and true. Richard left without another word. The door slamming behind him. The next day, Clara noticed Eleanor's quietness. Rough day? She asked. Her voice gentle. Eleanor nodded. Then, on impulse, told her about the will. Clara's eyes widened. Her face paling. Mrs. Grayson. No. That's too much. Eleanor reached for her hand. You gave me back my dignity. Clara. That's worth more than this house. Clara shook her head. Tears in her eyes. I just did my job. But Eleanor squeezed her hand. You did more than that. You saw me. For the first time. Clara didn't pull away. And they sat in silence. Hands clasped. The weight of the moment shared. Outside. The frost glittered on the roses. Fragile but enduring. Eleanor's days grew shorter. Each breath a quiet victory. She spent them in her garden when she could. Wrapped in a shawl. Watching the roses fight through the frost. Clara visited outside the hospital now. Bringing tea. Sharing stories. They'd become friends. Not just nurse and patient. Their bond forged in small moments of kindness. Eleanor hadn't told Richard about the will again. He hadn't returned since their fight. But she felt at peace. Her heart unburdened. One evening, Clara arrived with a small pot of rose clippings. I thought we could plant these together, she said, her smile tentative. Eleanor's eyes lit up. They worked side by side, Clara kneeling in the dirt, Eleanor guiding her with a trembling hand. The act was simple, but it felt like a passing of something sacred. The garden, the house, the love Eleanor had poured into both. That night, Eleanor wrote a letter to Richard, her words careful but honest. I love you, she wrote, but I needed to honor the person who reminded me I'm still here. Clara gave me that. I hope one day you understand. She sealed it, leaving it for Margaret to deliver after she was gone. The end came quietly. A week later, Eleanor lay in her hospital bed, Clara at her side. The room was soft with morning light, and Eleanor felt no fear, only gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, her hand in Clara's. Clara's eyes glistened, but she smiled. Thank you, Eleanor. Those were the last words Eleanor heard, and they were enough. When the will was read, Clara was stunned, tears streaming as Margaret explained Eleanor's wishes. Richard was there, silent, his face unreadable. He took the letter, reading it alone. He didn't contest the will, didn't fight. The trust was generous, more than he'd expected. But the house, the land, went to Clara, who moved in months later, tending the roses with the same care she'd shown Eleanor. Clara never forgot Eleanor's story, her strength. She kept the garden alive, planting new roses each spring, a tribute to the woman who'd seen her. 2. Richard visited once. Years later, standing at the garden's edge. He didn't speak, but he left a single rose on the porch, a quiet acknowledgement of what he'd lost and what Eleanor had found. The estate stood as Eleanor's legacy, not just of land or wealth, but of love given to those who gave it back. The roses bloomed on, stubborn and beautiful, a testament to a life that was never useless.